Well, I appreciate you all coming. My name is Adam Andrews, and if you haven't heard by now, I'm the director of Center for Lit, which is a homeschool curriculum outfit up in Colville, up 395, about 70 miles. We've been operating for about 20 years in the subject of reading comprehension and literature. We're sort of a great books homeschool curriculum outfit. And our passion and our goal is to help moms and dads and indeed classroom teachers of all stripes teach the great books more effectively. And the way we do that is that we have developed a teaching methodology, a pedagogy for approaching the subject that turns out to be really powerful and is applicable to any book in the world, any story in the world, because the principles of literary reading are the same regardless of the book you're using, regardless of the reading level even. I gave a talk yesterday where we used A Bargain for Francis by Russell Hoban about the two badgers who can't get along, and tried to make the point that the essential structural elements of that story are more or less identical to the structural elements in Shakespeare's Hamlet or Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. And that learning about these structural elements and how they fit together when you're 5 or when you're 8, reading A Bargain for Francis, is a great way to begin preparing yourself to read Shakespeare and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy later in life. This way, we've developed, based on this methodology, a K through 12 approach to teaching literature. So that's our main goal, and we found it really helpful with homeschool parents and classroom teachers since 2003. However, along the way, we also have kept in mind, my wife and I, that we are primarily parents in all of this. And the fact that we've been able to publish something and sell it to a few people over the years is really secondary to our main goal, which is to raise our own kids in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And have spent a lot of time thinking about how best to do that in the school environment, in the academic environment. And it turns out that the questions are important, and they amount to a heavy burden living in the culture that we live in, because we are bombarded, as you all well know, by myriad voices. Not only ourselves, but our kids are surrounded by voices telling them true things and false things about who they are and what the world is made of and how it works and how it runs. And there are things out there that it's my job as a loving father to protect my kids from. But also it's my job as a loving father to teach my kids how to properly handle them and to take them from being little babies in my house where protection from the world is my only job to having young men in the house, for whom sending them out into the world armed with a worldview is my primary job. And the question of how I transition from that one stage to the other weighs on my mind as a homeschool dad. And so I want to talk about that today with respect to books and literature being one of the main places where kids and grown-ups indeed hear a myriad voices and hear worldviews that are strange and threatening to me sometimes. And so let me begin by talking about what I mean by this phrase, worldview. I'm sure it's possible that you're familiar with it, but in the way I use it, let's talk about what it means. A worldview is the collection of assumptions that you take into interacting with the world around you. If you were to list all of the important questions about reality, questions like, is there a God, and if so, what is he like? What is a man? What is the relationship between God and man? How should it be characterized? How should men live together in society? What's the definition or the nature of a good society? What is love? What is a good love? What is love good for? What is a good life in this world of men? What is life good for? What is a good death in this world of men? What is death good for? What is the greatest good in the world? What is the greatest evil in the world? How can that good be grasped or fostered? How can that greatest evil be avoided? These questions, the questions at this level, if you made a list of all of them and then wrote down your answers, the sum and collection of your answers would amount to what I call your worldview. And it's the fact that this list of questions exists and that this list of questions has answers in my mind that creates the burden that I'm talking about. Because, of course, I want my kids to go out in the world with the same list of answers that I have. It's important to me. It's one of the reasons I'm a dad, I think, is to send my sons, for example, out into the world answering those important questions the same way that I do. Don't raise your hand, but how many of you have the same goal? And it's also true, and this creates the burden. Good morning, welcome. This creates the burden, this second fact, which is that the books my kids read, and indeed the movies that they watch, and the music that they listen to, and the strangers that they associate with, very often have a different set of answers to that list of questions. And very often, the list of answers is so different that the collected answers amounting to their worldview is a threat. And so I'm between a rock and a hard place. And I know that you're all in the same position. Now, you've probably thought about these things before. And it turns out that homeschooling them and giving them a literary education doesn't really help you all that much necessarily, because it's not just the movies, it's also the books. I was teaching Shakespeare to a group of homeschool students one time, and I had a mom come up to me saying, "How dare you expose my children to William Shakespeare?" And I will admit to being taken aback by that, but I asked her what she meant, and she said, "There is foul stuff in William Shakespeare," which I had to admit was true. I gave her credit for being a close reader. Shakespeare was a big fan of the bawdy joke. And it's on every page of Shakespeare. And she said, "I object." And here's the problem. There are some things that I object to in the books that form the skeletal backbone of Western civilization, the Western literary tradition. What do I do about that? I want to talk about that today and talk about how we can safely pass on our own worldviews to our kids and at the same time give them a literary education worthy of the name right in our own homes. So I want to use a couple of examples of works of literature that may present opposing worldviews and raise the question of how to properly handle them, and then hopefully leave some time for good discussion at the end. But let me start by bringing up the subject of Jack London. You know Jack London, the author of outdoor stories for boys, White Fang, Sea Wolf, Call of the Wild. If you've never read his 1908 short story, To Build a Fire, you should put it on your summer of 2023 reading list. This harrowing description, it's very short by the way, this harrowing description of a man's struggle for survival in the sub-zero temperatures of the Yukon Territory will solve the summer heat problem for you. The story's protagonist, who is referred to only as the man, he doesn't have a name, this protagonist has been warned about the dangers of extreme cold. And yet, as the story opens, he foolishly, it turns out, begins a day-long hike on foot toward a distant mining camp, accompanied only by his dog. And as the temperature falls, despite the fact that the sun is rising, the man slowly realizes that he is engaged this day in a life or death struggle against the cold. It will take careful planning and foresight for him to survive it. Unfortunately, this man is plagued by bad luck from the very beginning of his journey. First of all, he accidentally steps in an icy stream and realizes immediately that he must build a fire right now to dry himself. And so he builds the fire, but stupidly locates the fire beneath a snow-laden tree. And the fire's heat dislodges the snow from an overhanging branch, which falls on the fire and puts it out. And to make matters worse, by the time he arranges wood for another fire, his hands are too cold to manipulate the matches. The narrator tells us that by this time it is 70 degrees below zero. A dull sense of dread overtakes the man as he realizes that he has in fact miscalculated the cold and, worse, has miscalculated his own ability to withstand it. Next, he tries to kill his dog so that he can use its body for warmth. But the animal senses his fear and won't let him come near. And finally, the man quietly freezes to death while the dog slinks off to find another, wiser master. The end. There it is, Jack London's To Build a Fire. So I was teaching this story to a group of Christian parents, maybe not unlike yourselves, recently. And at the discussion's end, one parent approached me with a familiar reaction. She said, I noticed that this book doesn't seem to have any Christian lessons in it. It's disturbing, she said. It's full of hopelessness and despair. Isn't there any way that we can, as Christian readers and teachers, redeem this story? Or at least understand it better by reading it from a Christian perspective? And of course, on the one hand, she was absolutely right in her initial observation. There aren't any obvious Christian lessons in To Build a Fire. Turns out it was written by an atheist as a more or less faithful representation of his naturalistic worldview. It is disturbing and full of hopelessness and despair because presumably the author wanted it that way. But her question, this parent's question about redeeming the story, betrays a common error that I want to point out as we begin today. She assumed that the trick of reading from a Christian perspective involves finding Christian lessons in a story where none seem to be apparent at first. In other words, reading like a Christian means reading Christianity into everything you read. And I think we parents often do this when we mine classic literature for examples of godly character traits to emulate. Or when we mine classic literature for ungodly traits to avoid. I think we do this when we use the man in To Build a Fire as an example of some character flaw, laziness, lack of planning, carelessness, arrogance. And we say to our kids, you see what happens when you ignore good advice? You see what happens when you go out in the cold without your woolly underwear on? See what happens when you only take a dog? You should call ahead. I think this is a big mistake, and that's why I want to talk to you today. I'm not saying it's not important to work hard, plan ahead, heed sound advice, dress warmly. But the problem with using To Build a Fire to teach these lessons to our kids is that they flatly contradict the point that Jack London was trying to make with his story. The importance of diligence and humility are our ideas, not Jack London's ideas. London's point in To Build a Fire is that the man could not possibly have worked hard enough, planned ahead long enough, or listened carefully enough to the advice offered him. He was doomed before he even started by deterministic forces utterly beyond his control, from the merciless cold to his own inherited lack of imagination, as London puts it. And furthermore, the man's lack of character has nothing to do with his failure, because there's no such thing as character in this story. Morality appears nowhere in To Build a Fire. London's message in the story, if there is one, is this: you, man, are stuck within the limitations of your species, and there is nothing you can do about it except die. And you're going to die all the more quickly if you fail to kill your dog. The end. Jack London's To Build a Fire was intended to be a dark story devoid of moral lessons. And when we use it to teach moral lessons anyway, we misread the story on purpose. And in the process, we teach our students to ignore the author's words and substitute words of their own. Plan ahead, dress properly, heed sound advice. Eventually, we teach them to make every story they read into the sermon they heard last Sunday about how important it is to behave like Christians. C.S. Lewis addresses this topic in his masterful book on literary criticism called An Experiment in Criticism, which if I could make one book recommendation for you in the subject of reading well and teaching students to read well, this would be it. C.S. Lewis, An Experiment in Criticism. He warns us against this error in words that could easily have been directed to well-meaning teachers of To Build a Fire or to any non-Christian story. Listen to Lewis. Quote, "We are so busy doing things with the work that we give it too little chance to work on us. Thus, increasingly in our reading, we meet only ourselves." Think about that for a minute. We're so busy doing things with the work, making it say what we want our children to hear, that we give it too little chance to work on us, and thus increasingly in our reading, we meet ourselves. Everything says what we want it to say. It looks like a mirror, a book, instead of a window. Well, maybe there's a question arising in your mind right now. Why does it matter if we use an author's words for our own ends? Why does it matter if we misread To Build a Fire on purpose? After all, we parents are trying to do what I described at the beginning of the lecture, right? We're trying to pass on a Christian worldview to our kids. We're trying to teach Christian morality to impressionable minds that are our responsibility. Does not this all-important end justify whatever means we choose? I don't care if I'm committing a sin against Jack London's 1908 short story. I'm trying to teach my kid to put on woolly underwear. That's more important. Well, it's not more important in this case because I think it involves breaking the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. When we use a story like To Build a Fire to teach moral lessons that the author did not intend, we tell a lie about him, making him out to be something that he wasn't. Worse yet, we make our students complicit in the lie, even teaching them to tell similar lies of their own. Some moral lesson that is. The Epistle of James in the New Testament, which was written to teach moral lessons, by the way, says this: "Let everyone be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath." Let everyone be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. I think this is the very heart of what it means to read like a Christian. Let the author say what he means to say, and don't interrupt. Again, C.S. Lewis from An Experiment in Criticism, he puts it best. The first demand that any work of art makes upon us is surrender. Look, listen, receive. Get yourself out of the way. There is no good first asking whether the work before you deserves such a surrender, for until you have surrendered, you cannot possibly find out. Surrender. Let the author say what he means to say, and don't interrupt. Now, I put the point to you this way because I'm anticipating objection. I'm actually trying to make an objection occur in your minds. And the objection I'm trying to plant in there is this: what good is To Build a Fire then? Look, time is short. There's a million books out there. Why should I read one that, first of all, doesn't have any Christian lessons in it? And secondly, you just told me it's against the rules to put one in there. If it's dark and depressing and hopeless but cannot be redeemed by reading Christian values into it, why in the world should I read it? Why indeed? Why do I recommend Jack London's To Build a Fire? Which I do. I think it's great. Well, let me answer that question by talking about another story. I want to give you a little broad treatment here. I want to talk about Ernest Hemingway for a minute. Do you know Hemingway, the great 20th century American? He won the Nobel Prize for Literature shortly after publishing The Old Man and the Sea in 1953. It is a great little novel. And I want to tell you the story of The Old Man and the Sea. It opens on Santiago, who is an ancient fisherman. And he is mired, we find on page 1, in an epic streak of bad luck. He has not caught a fish in many days. So many days, in fact, that he is near starvation. And he has been shunned as cursed by the other fishermen in the small village where he lives. And the novel tells the story of his last voyage, in which he travels farther out into the sea than anyone has ever dared before, and catches the greatest fish in history. Now, as a master fisherman, Santiago draws on his expert knowledge of fishing and his long experience on the ocean to hook this giant fish, who then drags the tiny boat out into the heart of the sea by virtue of his own strength and power. And there a long and weary struggle ensues, during which both fish and fishermen reach the absolute limits of their endurance. And Santiago finally triumphs. And when he finally reels the exhausted fish to the boat 3 days later, he finds that it is literally too big to bring on board. And so he must lash it to the gunwales of his boat for the long journey home. Spectacular. Before he can reach the safety of his village, however, the boat is beset by sharks who strip the fish to the bone, eating every single morsel and leaving nothing but a skeleton. Though Santiago's skill and endurance have enabled him to best the fish in hand-to-hand combat and have brought him to the brink of salvation, he is finally undone by a cruel twist of fate. Or, you might say, by a universe that does not care to reward qualities like skill and endurance. He arrives on shore empty-handed and calmly accepts his utter, absolute defeat. The end. The end. Nobel Prize. But let me hasten to say, this is a fabulous novel. Students love it. Teachers love it. It is beautifully written. If you like Hemingway at all, it's his very best work. Even if you don't like Hemingway, you've got to acknowledge his mastery of the English language, first of all. It's a fine example of his spare, direct style, for which he's justly famous. His main character, Santiago, richly deserves the iconic status that he has enjoyed since 1953. But, at the same time, parents who are interested in reading this novel from a Christian perspective will have the same trouble with The Old Man and the Sea that they had with To Build a Fire earlier. Because just as with To Build a Fire, The Old Man and the Sea was not intended to communicate Christian themes. As a matter of fact, Hemingway makes some rather direct assaults on Christianity in The Old Man and the Sea, leaving little doubt about his animosity towards God and religion. In fact, a close reading of the novel suggests that, or reveals, I should say, that its themes spring from nihilism, which is a philosophy based on the atheistic assumption that there is no purpose or transcendent meaning or significance to life whatsoever. And so, as I've just said, trying to make a story like this reflect Christian themes, I think, is the exact opposite of reading like a Christian, because it involves telling a lie about Ernest Hemingway. He was not trying to teach your kids Christianity. And saying that he was and using his story to teach Christianity to your kids is breaking the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. In this case, our neighbor is Ernest Hemingway, who died in the 60s, but is nevertheless lives in the pages of his novel and is our neighbor, and I would say deserves the charity that all our neighbors deserve. And we should not bear false witness against him. But back to the question at hand. Remember, I asked the question, why should we read it then? Why To Build a Fire if A, it doesn't have any Christian themes in it, and B, it's against the rules to stick them in there on our own? If we don't reinterpret Hemingway so that his book teaches Christian lessons, aren't we just letting a godless, atheist, nihilist have the last word with our students? Why should we bother? Well, I want to go back to Lewis again. What would Lewis say in an experiment in criticism? Listen to this line. My own eyes, Lewis says, are not enough for me. I would see through those of others. My own eyes are not enough for me. I would see through those of others. I think Lewis understood something about the reading process and about the lack of reading that he's trying to communicate in this sentence. If you don't read widely, you are liable, Lewis suggests, to become a prisoner of narrow and weakly held opinions, because your experience is limited by your own time and place. 21st century Western North America is not the only time and place that's ever existed. And the concerns of this time and place are not universal necessarily. Maybe some of them are, maybe some of them aren't. How will you know? Lewis suggests that reading great literature, on the other hand, enables us to encounter the opinions of a host of people from other times and places. And so, come to a place where we can sift and discern what are the universal questions? What are the universal concerns? What about life in 21st century Western North America partakes of the eternal things? A reader who reads widely, even if he's young, can see the consequences of the opinions and the worldviews of other people from other times and places without having to adopt their philosophies as his own. He doesn't need to go to college and sit in the class of a Marxist and become a Marxist in order to understand the philosophy of Marxism. He can read about it in a novel. In the process of comparing his assumptions with those of other people, his own worldview can gain strength and clarity. In short, reading offers him the opportunity for a real education in philosophy and worldview, all from the comfort of his own home. But maybe there's another objection that can be boiled down like this. Isn't that a little dangerous? I mean, some parents worry, rightly, that exposure to non-Christian philosophies in literature, or in movies, or in music, or in associations with kids on the street corner, especially if they are not reinterpreted along Christian lines, may threaten the fragile faith of those kids. The fragile faith of our students may be at risk here. I understand this concern. I think there's something to it, but I want to push back just a little bit and suggest that the godless philosophies we encounter in our reading do not make us godless any more than the homelessness we encounter in reading makes us homeless. If I know how to read properly and closely and interact faithfully with the stories that I read, then reading The Old Man and the Sea doesn't have to make me a nihilist any more than reading Huckleberry Finn will make me an irreligious vagabond. But it will do something else. It will do something else. Reading The Old Man and the Sea can give me a deep understanding of the problem of nihilism and the tragic results of denying the existence and revelation of God. The Old Man and the Sea can give me insight into the unanswered questions of the nihilist, an insight that all the Christian stories in the world can't give me. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this. There is no better way to understand nihilism than to read a book that springs from nihilistic assumptions. Not a book by someone trying to debunk nihilism, or a book where nihilist philosophy is the subject, like an encyclopedia article on nihilism. That's not what I'm talking about. A book where nihilism itself is the unspoken, assumed worldview of the author. Hemingway, you see, was no expert on Christianity, but he was an expert on nihilism. And it would be foolish to ask our students to look to Hemingway for guidance on Christianity. But his books can teach us worlds about nihilism. But maybe you're asking, maybe there's another objection. Maybe you're saying, why in the world would I want to do that, Andrews? I go back to what we said at the beginning. Time is short. I'm going to have him read the Gospel of Mark again instead. I mean, we don't give the U.S. Treasury agents contact with counterfeit dollar bills, teach them how to detect them, do we? No, we don't. We give them the real thing over and over, morning till night, until the presence of a counterfeit bill shocks their system and they can identify it that way. Maybe it's not dangerous to read a nihilistic book, but is it desirable? Maybe it's just a waste of time. I think not, for this reason. Ernest Hemingway was not the last nihilist. He was only the most eloquent nihilist. And he spoke in his novels for thousands upon thousands of people who have lost their way and denied God. And many of those people live today and interact with us and with our students, or will interact with us and with our students at some point after they graduate. In books like The Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway beautifully explained the source of the pain and despair that plague our neighbors. Maybe in many cases, maybe in most cases, better than they can explain it themselves, not being writers, not being gifted at taking an idea, taking a pain and despair in the heart and putting it in those beautiful, polished, clipped sentences that communicate so effortlessly. This is the other profound implication of what Lewis says about seeing through the eyes of others. When we learn to do that, using the opportunity afforded to us by the great books, those books can broaden our understanding and enable us to have compassion on a lost world. Examining an author's book to understand the source and implications of his worldview always enables us to relate more effectively to those in our own day and age who share it. When we are quick to hear and slow to speak in our reading, we have an easier time being quick to hear and slow to speak in our relationships. And in the end, when we learn to really read like Christians, we are able to communicate the love of God more effectively to our neighbors. This is why I would argue for and advocate close and careful reading of books like To Build a Fire by Jack London, The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, and countless others that come from distinctly non-Christian worldviews. There are questions of application of this idea and these principles that I would love to discuss. And so what I want to do is kind of stop in this lecture for now and have a little discussion about some objections that you may have or some questions that you may have. And then if there's time, I want to take up a third example and talk about The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is another kind of poster child for 20th century debauchery, and see if we can't make an argument for reading that one as well. But let's stop right now and talk about this for just a minute. I'm suggesting that in my mission as a protective, careful, earnest dad, trying to raise up thinkers in the kingdom of God for the kingdom of God, I'm suggesting that Jack London and Ernest Hemingway are critical components and should be assigned and read and discussed. What are the implications of that are troubling? What questions would you have for me about that project? Yes, sir.
So the obvious one to me, and it's something that we hear about in current events today. Where would you draw the line, say, at the public library with what material they would still include as good literature versus goes too far and maybe is introducing, say, young kids to pornographic level ideas or content? Can you speak to that and what the difference is?
Sure, absolutely. Interesting. I'm going to sound like just an acolyte of C.S. Lewis, but you could do worse. In an experiment in criticism, Lewis says, look, I'm not talking about pornography. He actually says that in one of his paragraphs. We're talking about literature. And everybody draws a line between obscenity and honest artwork. And, you know, it's a famously difficult line to draw. The U.S. Supreme Court is on record as saying, I don't know what obscenity is, but I know it when I see it. And that's like that's as close as we can come. Sort of partakes of the talk I gave last night. It's beyond us, but there's a line there somewhere. And Lewis would say, the first job of any parent is to draw that line. In the medieval world, they called it a pale. It was like a circle, and inside that circle called a pale are things that the king would deal with. And outside that circle, called the pale, are things that was on their face, not appropriate for the king to even countenance. That's where we get the phrase outside the pale. I've heard that phrase before, right? So the king is basically drawing a line, saying, this is, inside this line is my domain. And Lewis suggests that the first job of a parent is to draw the pale. And the thing I have to say about that is it is very important to draw that pale. I agree, it's your number one job. And the second thing I have to say is that no one can do it but you. And the third thing I have to say is everybody draws it in a different place. And the fourth thing I have to say about that is by the will of God. The Lord put us in families on purpose so that there would be a decentralization of pale drawing going on. That the father and the mother together deciding how to handle these things with their children would be an individual decision. And they can be guided by the Holy Spirit and guided by the truths of Scripture and guided by their own lights. But on the one hand, it's necessary to draw a pale. And on the other hand, you have to do that for yourself. Lewis would suggest that that pale be drawn as widely as you can be comfortable with because of the benefits that accrue from reading broadly. He would never want the pale drawing to get so narrow that you're not reading broadly anymore and not encountering anything that's uncomfortable or new or different. But in the realm of practical advice, he actually mentions pornography. I'm not talking about pornography. And there are a couple of other things that in the Andrews house that we just said, you know what, that stuff is outside the pale. You're going to have to read that when you're grown up or later. You know, and obviously this is an age-appropriate thing too, right? You don't give Huckleberry Finn to a 5-year-old because racism is heavy. And maybe it's not time to carry that around. I didn't want my kids to read To Kill a Mockingbird until they were in high school either because sexual assault is heavy. And let's not carry that around yet. I don't want to have that conversation with you right now. Go outside and play in the dirt, you know? And so that's my job. And I was talking to a guy that was in this talk yesterday and he said, you know, I'm a filter. As a dad, I'm a filter. And I want to be careful about what I let through the filter. I see your point that I need to let stuff in. That's part of my job too. But a filter does two things at once. It lets stuff in and it keeps stuff out. And so I think that obviously there's no rule I can give you about that. But I think thinking about it and being aware of the benefits of interaction with the world is enough to get us thinking in the right direction. Yes, sir?
I don't have an objection as much as a consideration. When I read something like To Build a Fire, I think about, like when we talk about it with our children, because we like to be outside and we like to hunt and we like to fish and learn how many different ways can we build fires. I'm not saying we're good at it yet, but that book is especially fun to chew on because there are some things, and I don't know whether this is going to transgress your rule about inappropriately imputing Christian ideas on what the author has read and his intent. The thing is that there are experiences and truths and rocks and cliffs and bears out there that don't care what I write or how I think because God made them that way. And if I step off one, the same thing is going to happen whether I'm a Muslim or whether I'm a Christian believer. And because that's how God made this world. So I think even in his writing of that story, when we consider the failure to build the fire, the presence of the dog, the effort that he's making, the knowledge that he has built up, like how is he going to build that fire? Like that, we're going to spend an hour talking about that. But I think that there are things that God has done in this creation that are bigger than Jack London. That Jack London saw around him and probably experienced because of how, like, it grips you when you read it. You're like, it seems like he's been there.
Yeah.
At least to some degree, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that the way God made the creation will speak into his story whether he likes it or not. And to notice those things maybe is okay and say, if I go out into this and I'm not prepared, I mean, there's something about wisdom right there. Maybe you think about it as planning. Maybe it's a different way to think about it, but I don't know.
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that Jack London had experience with the troubles of the Yukon Territory. He was writing from his own experience in winter in the Yukon, and he observed things about extreme cold and how the human animal responds to extreme cold and how it's necessary to prepare for it and how dangerous it is to not. He recognized all of those very, very true things about God's world. He wouldn't have called it God's world, but he did recognize them, and they are true. If you step in an icy stream in that situation, you got about 5 minutes to get your fire built, or you're dead. The point of his novel, or his short story, however, is what are the philosophical implications of that situation? And there's an important sense in which that's the reason he wrote the story.
Right.
And so to have a conversation about something else is, and I don't want to put this too baldly, and I don't want to be offensive here, but to have a conversation about something else is to change the subject on him ever so slightly. And to say, yes, I get that you're trying to have a philosophical conversation with me about the nature of man. But what I really want to talk about is this over here. To which Jack London could reasonably say, yeah, but that's not why I wrote the story, though. I wrote the story to talk about the fact that the man and his dog were not equally prepared for this. The dog was better prepared. And that there's something about the comparison between man and dog where the man does not come out looking like the pinnacle of creation. The dog does, because evolution has suited him better for surviving in extreme cold. He's got a fur coat on his ears. Oh, that the man had a fur coat on his, like that. That's the conversation he's trying to have. And so I think that both of those things are probably legitimate. Look, Jack London is a recipient of common grace and an observer of God's world, and also a philosopher of atheistic materialism. And eventually we need to take that into account. I guess that's what I meant.
I think some of my weakness is that without knowing his philosophical point of view, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to get there.
Well, that's interesting. I'm glad you bring that up.
We're still going to enjoy the process of reading it and discussing it.
Sure.
And Lord willing, we'll gain some knowledge and we'll gain some perspective and wisdom along the way. And I really like what you're saying about letting the book speak for itself, and to consider, how did that person think?
Yeah.
And that I can gain understanding about other people who think very differently than I by interacting with them, sometimes through what they wrote, sometimes by talking to them without feeling the need to convince them of something in that conversation. Right in that moment.
Yeah, because that's not ever going to work generally.
That's true.
So here, I'm glad you put it that way. That's a very thoughtful question, because we've done a lot of work preparing parents to have these kind of conversations. And I like when you say, look, we're probably not smart enough to get that. I mean, you obviously seem like a literary guy that has spent a lot of time thinking about these things. But what we've done is actually write a list of questions that help a teacher let a book like that unfold its philosophies. And we have them in a product that we sell called the Worldview Detective. It's down on our book table. And it's basically a Socratic list of discussion questions that you can ask of your students after you've read a story from an opposing worldview. And they're very simple questions, but we've sussed them out and given some complex versions of them. But they start like this. In the world of this story, what is the greatest good? In the world of this story, if all you have is the experience of the man in the Yukon Territory and what we know about his career from the pages of the story, what's the greatest good?
Survival.
Survival, right? What's the greatest evil in the world of this story?
Death.
Death, clearly, right? The man is trying to avoid death so that he can survive. Okay, let me ask you another question, and this is in this Worldview Detective. In the world of this story, what amounts to a good life? What is a good life? Is a good life self-sacrifice and charity toward the poor? Conquering nature for the purpose of survival, right? You could say that in the world of this story, a good life is a long one, right? A life that extends into tomorrow. Please.
Well, I was just going to say, and you can see how that translates easily into today as far as just look at COVID. I think a lot of the policies that came about were due to the same idea of self-preservation at all levels. You know what I mean? You can see how it comes into play in a lot of areas.
Sure.
People who they don't have the eternal perspective.
Yeah.
You can say, this is where that perspective comes from. That's that self-preservation at all cost. Cost of relationship, cost of,
Yeah, absolutely.
you know.
Absolutely right. Let me ask you another question about Jack London's story. In the world of the story, what is a good death?
Old age.
A late one.
Not in the world of the story, though. Old age is never mentioned, but death is mentioned.
Swift.
Okay. The death of someone else. That's a good death in this story. The death of the dog would have been a good death.
Because that would have saved.
Because survival is the highest good, right? The death of someone else is a good death. Or you could really, in the world of this story, there's no such thing as a good death. Death is the greatest evil, right? Do we agree with that? Is there such a thing as a good death? When I read this story with my kids, we always say, I hope so. My whole life is dependent on the idea of a good death. That there was a good death. And then that my life, if it's going to be well lived, it's going to be lived in imitation of that good death. Right? How can the greatest evil in this story be overcome? And by the way, this is a question you can ask of To Build a Fire, or of The Old Man and the Sea, or of King Lear, or of any book that you're reading. How can the greatest evil in this story be overcome?
In that world, you can't do that. Is that what you're...
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see who was talking. Yeah, please.
In that world, in Jack London's world, it can't be.
One implication of the story is that it can't be overcome, that death is inevitable, and that the man in the story doesn't have enough imagination, doesn't have enough evolutionary development in order to prevent it. So there is one implication is that there's nothing to do about it. You could also argue from the pages of the story that he presents, that you can kill somebody else. You can overcome the greatest evil by passing it off on someone else, I suppose. But these are just examples of the questions that you could ask in discussion of a story in order to bring the philosophy that sort of underlies the story to the surface. By now, we can realize that London doesn't agree with us on some pretty important basic principles, right? Regardless of his knowledge of the conditions and his knowledge of how nature works, for sure, which I think can obviously be profitably paid attention to and understood. But you could apply these questions to any story in the world, and that's kind of what we're interested in doing. Any other questions or thoughts? I hope that was a faithful answer to your question. Thank you. That was a thoughtful question. Any other thoughts about this general approach? Yeah.
I mean, my kids are still pretty little. Do you have any suggestions for younger? Please.
Thank you for asking that. That's a really good question. My wife always reminds me not to get too exercised about Jack London and Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald when I give this talk, because many of our students are still in the early stages of homeschooling, and it's not time for this yet. It's not time for this yet. I don't want my fourth grader looking off into the abyss of a world without God. That is not what he needs from me. He needs things in the proper order, right? When he's little, he needs to know that Daddy is home and all is well. And that he is, and then as he grows up, he needs to know that he gets his identity from the love of his parents. And he needs to know and in his reading, he needs to have that stuff reinforced. I give a talk about preparing kids to go off to college, and it's related to this. I say the kid needs three things in order to be a self-conscious, self-contained thinking person in this world. The first thing he needs is a firm worldview that's been built for him by someone else and handed to him that he knows in and out. He needs to know his own heritage, intellectually and spiritually and emotionally. He needs to be a product of his own family. And that's the job of parents when the kids are little. We don't introduce anything strange when they're little. We're teaching them what it means to be an Andrews around here. And why do we love, and who loves us, and how do we handle stuff, and what's the world supposed to run? How's it supposed to run? The second thing he needs is exposure to strange worldviews, so that he can compare them. And that's a stage 2 parenting teaching thing. And until you've got stage 1 sort of in hand, introducing stage 2 can be a little corrosive and maybe dangerous and confusing. And so we have to decide when to start introducing strange worldviews as a stage 2 process. I think that still happens while they're at home, though. That's what I'm arguing for. It should happen while they're junior high and high school level. The third thing he needs, of course, is he needs to be thrown out into the world where the questions that worldview is designed to answer confront him in his heart, and he asks them for himself. The third thing he needs is, oh no, my only answer to is there a God is yes because my daddy told me there was. I don't think I've ever really thought about it before. Is there a God? I think I need to start from zero and figure that out. That's the third thing he needs. And he can't really have it effectively until he's got things 1 and 2 sort of in place. I always argue that going off to college is really productive of this kind of questioning. And it was really good for me when I was coming along, because I was a preacher's kid who had a really firm worldview in hand and had some exposure to non-Christian worldviews of the world. And I frankly was as arrogant as an 18-year-old can possibly be, and thought I had every answer to every question in the whole wide world that had ever been asked. I had never asked any of those questions, however. I just sort of naturally assumed that anyone who honestly had those questions was one of 2 things: an idiot or possessed by Satan. If you've got the temerity to disagree with me, you're either stupid or evil. And I went off to college and found that neither one of these things was hardly ever true. These people were just as smart as me, and nice people who were just literally asking the universal questions. And so in interacting with them, I came to ask those questions myself. And it was really comforting to my parents to learn that because I had a good foundation and had been exposed to the worldviews of the world, and the gospel is actually true, 99% of the time I came back to the original answer. But through a very productive route, through a route of asking those questions for myself. And so I think it's kind of a 3-stage process. A long answer to your question, I'm sorry. A 3-stage process. And if your kids are little, they're in stage 1, where every book they read, every interaction they have with you and with the world should be to build and reinforce a good, solid Christian worldview. Thank you for asking. That's a really good one to touch on. Anybody else? You guys want to hear about the Great Gatsby for a few minutes? We've got 10 minutes left. I'll have to go fast, but we know about the Great Gatsby, right? 1925, novel of the jazz age. I just have a couple of comments about it because I don't know, maybe it's not appropriate here. Does the Great Gatsby sort of stand in your mind as a book we should be wary of, that we should shy away from?
I didn't like it in high school, but it was fine.
Let me just review the story and then we'll talk real quickly. I don't want to necessarily give you my whole spiel on it, but it takes place on 2 Long Island peninsulas called West Egg and East Egg. And these are these 2 peninsulas are the home to the super rich of 1920s New York. The story is set in 1923 or 24. It was written in 1925. So these upscale neighborhoods are separated from the city by a huge garbage dump called the Valley of Ashes, where the less fortunate characters in the story live. And over their barren land, we find in chapter 1, presides the ghostly image of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, an ophthalmologist whose bespectacled eyes gaze sightlessly out from a huge billboard in the center of this wasteland. Eckelberg himself is long gone, having given up his practice long ago and moved away. But his image remains to sort of mock the residents of the Valley of Ashes with an empty promise of vision or oversight or providence. And the story comes to us through the eyes of Nick Carraway, who is a stockbroker who has recently moved to New York from the Midwest. Carraway befriends the mysterious tycoon, Jay Gatsby, and helps him in his quest to win the love of Daisy Buchanan, who is a married socialite with whom Gatsby is obsessed. And along the way, Carraway, in his role as first-person narrator, takes the opportunity to observe and comment on Gatsby's brief and violent career. And here's how it goes. Gatsby owns the largest mansion on West Egg. and he throws the most decadent, lavish parties that anyone can remember. And though he appears to have riches beyond count, nobody knows where he got them. In fact, his entire past is a mystery. Who is Gatsby and where did he get his money are the questions on everybody's lips. But one thing Nick Carraway knows for sure. Jay Gatsby's desire to possess Daisy Buchanan is all-consuming. He will stop at nothing to woo her and so to realize his dream of success. And over the course of a single summer, this obsession leads to the destruction of his world and to his own violent death. The end. That's pretty much it. And Nick Carraway, realizing after Jay Gatsby has died, his dream of wooing and possessing Daisy Buchanan has crumbled all around him. Nick Carraway is disillusioned and says, I'm leaving New York, and he goes back to the Midwest. And he says, thus it will always be for people who pursue Gatsby's dream. That's it. Why should we read that? Why in the world? I mean, all the questions that apply to Build a Fire and to The Old Man and the Sea apply just as well to Gatsby. Why would I recommend that we read F. Scott Fitzgerald? By the way, this is the greatest novel of the 20th century. The greatest American novel of the 20th century, I think. Can you imagine why I would even say that? Well, I want to give you just a quick 2-minute, I have 5 minutes left. I want to give you a 2-minute defense of my crazy statement that this novel about basically drinking and sex and partying and disillusion and debauchery, which is what it is the greatest novel of the 20th century. And it has to do with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, published in 1859. I bet you didn't think I was going to say that. In 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and he suggested that it is not necessary for there to be a divine intelligence to have created the world, that the processes of biological evolution can have done it for us. And the implications of that suggestion completely remade Western intellectual history in the short space of about 60 years. Between 1860 and 1920, this idea that biological evolution can be used to explain the development of all life on Earth was not only completely dominating the world of biology by 1920, but also completely dominating every other world too. Politics, economics, technology, higher education, you name it. This is a documentable fact. By the time of World War I, all serious intellectuals, I don't know if that's an there might have been an exception, but 99.9% of serious intellectuals in the Western world acknowledged that the processes of evolution were responsible for what we see. And furthermore, that by virtue of our reason, we could manipulate the processes of evolution and recreate society biologically, economically, politically, legally, technologically, and in every other way, in our own image, in a glorious future. The implications and the power of Darwin's idea cannot be overstated. Cannot be overstated. And then, World War I. World War I came along in 1914 and completely destroyed the confidence that the world had built on Darwin's book and on his philosophy. Nobody could deny the utter failure of the idea that man in his reason, in the process of evolution, could remake society for glorious ends. Our Archduke Francis Ferdinand gets assassinated and Europe tumbles into the most bloody, unimaginable bloody war anyone had ever seen. And intellectuals in the wake of World War I, honest intellectuals in the wake of World War I, said two things. Number one, we have defined away the existence of God, and with it all of the moorings culturally and morally that previous generations depended on. And number two, we have failed to replace him with anything that works. And number three, what do we do now? Where is meaning and purpose? What do we hook society to? What does the individual do in thinking about himself as a person? Am I a lump of cells with a future? Well, Darwin tells me I'm a lump of cells, and World War I tells me I have no future. And the Scopes monkey trial, by the way, which happens in 1925, says, at least for Americans, that I can't use religion anymore because it's for fools. So now what? Think I'll have a drink. Think I'll get a girlfriend. Think I'll move to New York and become a stockbroker. Maybe that'll do it. Do you see what F. Scott Fitzgerald is doing? In 1925, in the wake of World War I, in the world that Darwin has created, he's saying, this is where we sit, people. Don't deny it. You're as culpable as I am. This is where we all sit, whether we want to be here or not. And what he says about taking a drink and getting a girlfriend and moving to New York is, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. You're going to end up dead. Gatsby, at one point early in the novel, he stretches his hands out toward a green light across the bay. And he's reaching for it. And it's green, symbolizing envy and money and power. And he can't reach it, but he might reach it. And he spends the whole novel reaching. Daisy Buchanan symbolizes it. If he can get Daisy Buchanan, he'll have the green light, and then all will be well. And in the last line of his novel, Fitzgerald says, we're all like Gatsby. We're all reaching for that green light, but it's all a mirage of ashes. And so we beat on, he says, boats against the current, hopelessly, ceaselessly borne back into the past, looking longingly over our shoulder to a past that Darwin destroyed, that World War I destroyed, that's never coming back. I think I'll go jump off a bridge. This is the greatest novel of the 20th century. Why do I say that? That's basically, by the way, a faithful representation of what Fitzgerald is trying to do in The Great Gatsby. And that's the historical situation that he's writing in. Why do I say that's the greatest novel of the 20th century? Yes, that is the 20th century. And we who are Westerners, who have the 20th century as our immediate cultural heritage, we've got to know that. We've got to know where we came from. There's another reason it's great, which is that F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of the greatest English writers who ever drew breath. His mastery of an English sentence is as good as Hemingway's, although totally different. He's a fabulous, beautiful prose stylist and a wonderful novelist, and it's a work of art. So, the long and short of it is, my talk today says, you should have your kids read The Great Gatsby. And you should give them a history lesson about Darwin and World War I, and you should say, look, kids, there's a lot of drinking and sex in this. That's part of life. When they're old enough, of course. The Great Gatsby is not for children. But it should be part of your literary education that you're passing on to them. We are heirs of the 20th century. We are heirs of Darwin and of World War I. And the gospel has come to us in our time and place so as to deal with the culture given to us by those events. The gospel applies to all times and all places, right? The late Roman Empire, the Viking invasions, the Crusades, the Black Death, early modernism, and the world of Charles Darwin and World War I as well. I should stop talking. I could go on and on and on. Thank you for your attention. Any final questions before we leave? I think I got 30 seconds. I'm down at the booth. It's got a little pelican on it, Center for Lit. I'm there with my wife. Be happy to talk with you. And I'll be speaking the rest of the day as well. So, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.